Hello everybody, hope you've had a safe and fun weekend. It's now term 6, week 3, and today's video is about recognising equivalent, decimal and fractions, particularly working with quarters, halves and 3/4, so you learn to recognise the decimal and fraction equivalents. At the end, there are some activities and also there are some further activities on Google Classroom. Enjoy and hope to see you soon. Bye.
So we are going to learn how to recognise some of the decimal equivalents to the common fractions that we know. So halves, quarters and 3/4, learning to recognise those. Let's have a look at our first slide. All right, let's go back a little bit to previous videos and learning that you have done. Here is a grid of 10 squares. Whoops, it's flown off. Okay, so what does each square represent? So if it's split into 10 equal parts, then each part represents 1/10. Or as a decimal number, we say 0.1. What happens if half of the 10 squares are coloured? So 5 of the squares, let's have a look. So let's just quickly colour those in, very roughly. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. We can now say that half of this group of 10 squares is coloured in. So that would represent 5/10 or 0.5, because 5/10 means 0.5. And if you have a look down here, you've done simplified fractions very recently. The simplified version of 5/10 we know is a half. Look, half of the whole shape is coloured in. So 5/10 simplified is 1/2, and how we write 1/2 as a decimal is 0.5. Let's just check our understanding of what we've just looked at. So we looked at 0.1 and 0.5 as decimals and fractions. Let's just put them on the place value chart so we understand. So here's our tenths column. Okay, so 0.1 will be here, 0.1. So remember, we coloured in 1 of those 10 squares on our 10 grid. So 0.1 is the decimal value of 1/10. And then 0.5, which we know is equivalent to a half, 0.5, because we coloured in 5 of those 10 squares. So there it is on your place value chart. Moving on, let's move on to quarters. Here is 100 square. Okay, we can use it to show 1/4 and 3/4 as decimals. So let's have a look. Each of these 100 squares represents 1/100th. So if we colour in 1 of those squares, or it looks pretty rectangular on my chart here, that is 1/100th. And you know that 1/100th as a decimal is 0.01. Okay, now how are we going to find out what 1/4 is? I think a really good way of doing that is to section off 1/4 of our 100 square. So let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay, and we're gonna just colour this in really messily. but I want to just show you that I have sectioned off 1/4 of this 100 square. That's slightly better. Sorry, everybody. I know your colouring in is a lot better than mine. But as you can see, now how many squares have I coloured in there? 1/4 of 100 is 25. So we call that 25 over 100. That's our big fraction. Okay, 25 over 100 is equivalent to 1/4. You can see it here. Okay, because 25 can be divided by 25 once, and 100 can be divided by 25 4 times, which is why it's 1/4. Just thinking back there to your simplifying fractions. Okay, but the decimal of 25 over 100 is simply 0.25. So 25 over 100, 25 squares over 100, 25 out of 100 is the same as 1/4, and we write it as 0.25. So that is equivalent to 1/4. Okay, now what about 3/4? I can hear your brains ticking. You're going to go back to this 100 grid, and we are going to block off 3/4 of these squares. So look there, I've just done a half there, which, as you know, is 2/4. So if I just very messily again colour this in. Oops. There we go. So 3/4 of this 100 grid has been coloured in. What are 3/4? How many are 3/4 of those squares? So we've got 25 here in this quarter, 25 here, which makes 50, and another 25, which makes 75. Okay, so if we look at 75 over 100, here we go. So 75 over 100 here, right? Because we know that each little square represents 1/100th. We coloured in 75 hundredths. 75 squares is 0.75. Therefore, 3/4 is equivalent to 0.75. Just to make that point again, here's our first 25 squares. So 0.25 is the same as 1/4. Half. Right, so we're going to colour in half now, which is 50 squares, which in a decimal number is 0.50, or we say 0.5. We don't need to say the 0 because there are no hundredths. And here, another 25 makes up 75 squares coloured in, which is 0.75. Okay, so let's just plot those here. So 1/4 in our place value grid, 1/4 is going to be 0.25. All right. We know this, we've done it before. A half is 0.5. 5/10. So here we have 2/10 and 5/100. And 3/4 is 0.75. There we go. So your first task is to match the following decimals and fractions. So pause the screen here. Okay, let's see if you can recognise these fraction and decimal equivalents. Half is equivalent to 0.5. 3/4 is equivalent to 0.75. Remember those 75 squares out of the 100 that were coloured in. 1/4 is equivalent to 0.25. Well done. Let's have a look at the next slide. Pause your screen and have a go at these. Right, so half is equivalent to 0.5. Quarter is equivalent to 0.25. 3/4 is equivalent to 0.75. So I really hope that these fractions and decimals are going to be sticking into your heads, staying in your heads forever and ever, because we are repeating them. Let's have a look at the next slide. Okay, pause the screen, have a go. So write an equivalent fraction for each decimal. 0.5. The equivalent fraction is, I'm sure you've all got this, half. The equivalent fraction to 0.25 is 1/4. The equivalent fraction to 0.75 is 3/4. Good job. And now pause this screen and have a go at this. All right, so write a fraction that each of these shapes represents and the decimal equivalent. Now I'm going to find it hard to write in this small box. I am sure that you have got this. So the fraction here is 1/4, because one of the 4 shapes is shaded. And we know that as a decimal fraction, that is 0.25. 2 of the 4 shapes are shaded, so we know that that as a fraction is a half, 1/2, which we know as a decimal is 0.5. 3 of the 4 shapes are shaded, that's 3/4, which we know is 0.75. Okay, let's have a go at this one. Pause your screen. All right, half is 0.5. Quarter is 0.25. 3/4, 0.75. Good job. Okay, so it is really important that you guys learn these, particularly these three fraction and decimal equivalents, because it makes things a lot easier for you in the future. There are some sheets for you to work on having finished this video, so please go to your Google Classrooms and complete the sheets that are there. Okay, thank you very much for listening and watching. See you soon.